Hi, this is Pastor Josh from First Baptist Queen. Thank you for joining us on our Wednesday night study, a verse-by-verse walkthrough of the entire Old Testament. Tonight we are starting in 1 Samuel chapter 29, verse 1. Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish. So having had all the information in chapter 28, we see that this next section is some background information. It could also be considered a flashback. At the beginning of chapter 28, all of the Philistine forces have already gathered together to fight against the Israelites at Shunem. The Philistines seem to be gathering at Aphek and then heading out to encamp at Shunem, 30 or 40 miles away, for a more strategic attack position. This is what had prompted the fear in King Saul that sent him to the medium seeking Samuel. But chapter 29 here doesn't take us back to the battlefield for the battle the day after Saul sought the medium. This chapter takes us, the readers, back to when the Philistines were gathering up all their troops to head out to fight against the Israelites. It would seem that as the Philistine forces were assembling for war and heading out, that the groups of troops were marching in formation before the commanders of the Philistine army, and therein, between one Philistine battalion after another, was David and his 600 elite fighting force. They had gathered at the rear of all the other Philistines alongside Achish, the king of Gath. And this may have been because Achish thought of David as a friend. Or it may have been because Achish had made David his own personal bodyguard. Verse 3, the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years, and since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day?" So the commanders of the Philistines seemed to be shocked and maybe even a little offended that Achish would have Hebrews marching out with them. Notice the use of Hebrews here, the word, rather than Israelites. This may have had a racial connotation instead of the covenantal link to the ancestral name Israel. And Achish has David and his men behind all the other Philistine forces. He tries to defend his reasoning by saying that David has betrayed Israel and come to serve the Philistines and Achish. He says that David deserted the nation of his birth and has chosen to come to help the Philistines. But this, understandably, would have given the other Philistine commanders hesitation for several reasons. They had not been taken in by David's influence and gifts in the way that daily interaction had impacted Achish. In addition, many of them, if not all of them, remember David killing their champion, Goliath, and this would have been emphasized in all of their memories, as David was most likely still carrying Goliath's sword into battle with him that day. Not only that, but there had been another battle between the Philistines and Saul and Jonathan and the rest of the Israelites back in 1 Samuel 14. And that time there had been a number of seeming defectors from Israel among the Philistine fighters fighting for the Philistines. When the Philistines started fighting against Saul and Jonathan, those Israelite defectors changed sides. They took up arms against the Philistines among whom they had taken refuge. And in the ensuing chaos that caused the Philistines then, they started killing each other, not knowing who was on their side and who was on the other side. So all this was probably going through the minds of those commanders as they watched David and his men march by that day. Verse 4. But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. So the anger of the commanders was of such intensity that they defied the king and demanded that he send David away. They thought that the risk of the king's potential fury at their defiance was worth saying something against another potential betrayal in battle. And David's reputation was well known to all of these commanders. They were the Philistine experts in war. And here was the greatest fighter and commander that Israel has had. He's killed thousands of Philistines, not just Goliath, and he's never lost a battle. And Achish had invited him to come alongside them into battle against his native countrymen. But not only that, Achish had placed David at the rear of the Philistine army. At any moment, he could start fighting and killing all before the majority ever noticed that what was going on behind them. So to the commanders, such a thing would be a great way for David to earn his way back into Saul's good graces. Obviously, they didn't know Saul very well. David winning so much on the battlefield was what initially sparked Saul's animosity towards David. Saul would probably see David fighting against the Philistines and think that he was trying to steal the glory of victory for himself. The Philistine commanders are extremely adamant that David and his men must be sent back to their homes. They can still go back to their homes in the Philistine territory, but the commanders insist that they not go into battle with them. So Achish gives in to the commanders. Verse 6. Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." Now, it's very interesting that Achish is swearing by the Lord in his explanation to David. It doesn't seem possible that Achish has come to believe in the one God of Israel only without a recognition of that fact in the text. But we do know that the Philistine culture was polytheistic. They believed in many gods. So it could be possible that Achish is acknowledging the one true God as simply one of many gods. It can also be possible that his acknowledgement was merely a concession to David. Maybe he does genuinely feel as though he has grown close with David, and accordingly he has adopted some of his customs and language. And Achish is giving in to the demands of the commanders. But he's also trying to soften the blow in his explanation to David by saying that if it were up to him, David would be right there with him in the fight. Achish is affirming his absolute trust in David, which only reveals that he has completely bought into David's act of loyalty. So Achish asks David to leave in peace, to not make a bigger issue with the other Philistines who were already upset that he is there to begin with. Verse 8. And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, "I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle." So David here acts offended to have been requested to leave the battlefield. Yeah, it seems really hard to believe that David would indeed want to go out to fight against Saul in battle, for up until this point, David has repeatedly insisted and outright refused to raise anything against Saul. So maybe he was going out with Achish because Achish requested him to go with him as his own bodyguard, but maybe David merely meant to protect Achish during the battle as his bodyguard, or maybe the Philistine commanders had legitimate concerns. Maybe David intended to raise up arms against the Philistines once the battle had engaged. There doesn't seem to be any way that David is going to do any fighting against his own people. So his motivations must have been to finally reveal himself for who he was against the Philistines that day. And the Philistine commanders had great suspicions about all of it, so they greatly objected to David's presence with them. And though he tells Achish that he wants to be there with him, David gives in and leaves the assembly of the Philistine army. But Achish, he finishes his request to David here in verse 10. "Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who come with you, and start early in the morning." Notice he says it twice. "And depart as soon as you have light. So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. But the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So David, he very willingly left the assembly of the Philistines to return to Ziklag in the Philistine territory. They would then be the only remaining troops in all of Philistia, as all the Philistine army had gone out against Israel. This may have been the Lord's intervention of protection for David and his men, because as we saw in the last chapter, Saul was told that he was going to die in that very battle for which the Philistines were amassing. So David being sent away meant that there could never be any accusation against him at having anything to do with the death of Saul. You know, sometimes interruptions to our expected plans are exactly what the Lord has to protect us. We simply need to recognize the Lord's provision through what we assume to be a detour. Also, there seems to be very interesting compare and contrast between Saul and Achish. You know, both of them had made David their personal bodyguard, Saul in 1 Samuel 22 and Achish in 1 Samuel 28. Both of them were initially quite impressed with David and his abilities, especially his fighting abilities. Both of them also removed David from serving among their armies. Both of them were quite wrong in their assessment of who David was. Saul thought David was an enemy, while Achish thought David was an ally. Let's look at the next chapter. Chapter 30, verse 1. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. So on the third day, after David and his men had left Ziklag, the Amalekites came to attack. These were the one of whom Saul was supposed to have already destroyed many years ago. And while David and his men had been in Ziklag among the Philistines, David had been making daily raids against several nations, and the Amalekites were one of those. And they were raiding the Amalekite towns one at a time, wiping out everybody in town. And so maybe this was sort of a retaliation against David and his men for what they had been doing, though the passage earlier had said that nobody knew of David's raids because everybody had been killed. You know, maybe it was simply the evil, wicked Amalekites taking advantage of all of the fighting men leaving the Philistine territory. And so it seems to suggest that the Amalekites had people watching the troop movements of the Philistines, or at least the troop movements of David and his men. And when they felt that David and his men were not immediately returning as they had in the past, when they were conducting their raids, the Amalekites set out and struck Ziklag. They stormed the city and took all of the women as their spoils of war. But it's very interesting that the Amalekites didn't kill people because they were notorious for their violence. Maybe this was the Lord's provision in keeping all of the women alive. But David, at this particular point, he and his men had no idea that anything was happening at home while they were away. They went away for what only turned out to be a few days and were undoubtedly hoping to return home to their wives safe and sound. And their wives were probably worried for the safety of their husbands, all the while the husbands should have been worried for the safety of their wives. So when they came within sight of their home in Ziklag, it quickly became clear that something was wrong. Verse 3. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's two wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. So David and his men, they discovered the great tragedy, this great tragedy, that while they had gone out with the Philistines, their enemies, another enemy, came and kidnapped all their families. Can you imagine seeing the smoke rising on the horizon as you're marching home in enemy territory where you have been pretending to be friends? Maybe there were thoughts that they had been found out by the Philistines. I mean, at this point, David and his men had enemies everywhere. The Philistines, the Amalekites, the other nations they were raiding, the Geshurites, the Girzites, and their own king from Israel. When they were approaching the city, all kinds of thoughts about their potential attackers were probably racing through their minds. And so undoubtedly their pace quickens to the point of running as they approach the city. And then they run through the city only to discover that every single person was missing and all their possessions had been destroyed with fire. No one had been killed. And David probably knew this because there were no bodies anywhere, no blood anywhere. So the only conclusion that could be drawn was that they had all been taken. Maybe there was some kind of indication who the people were who had attacked. The text doesn't tell us they knew it was the Amalekites until later on. Maybe there was some kind of weapon or fabric or accessory left behind in the ensuing struggle that would reveal the attackers. Most likely not. It doesn't seem as though David and his men knew that yet. All they knew was that they had been attacked while they were away, and thoughts of how scared their families undoubtedly were filled their heads. And now David had lost 3 wives. His first had been given to someone else by Saul, and now these 2 wives were kidnapped. And then, as most often happens in life, and especially in tragedy, people want to blame someone for the terrible thing that's happened. We often want to find someone to blame rather than realizing that the sinfulness of the broken world is the real culprit. Paul said in Ephesians 6:12, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. So then how does David respond when he's challenged by his own men, his friends? Verse 6. And when David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So David's men became so desperate and distraught that they became completely unreasonable. They talked themselves into a frenzy and allowed mutiny to become the most logical course of action. Never mind that they had all come to David for help and for rescue and for leadership. Never mind that their loyalty to David, the Lord's anointed, was the only thing that had kept them alive for so long. Never mind, David had indeed rescued them all time and time again, even times they probably didn't realize he was doing it. When an outside enemy attacked, their natural inclination was to attack their own. How quick they were to turn on probably the most godly person that any of them knew at the time. This is exactly what the enemy does. He will seek to divide and conquer all the time. And he will use anything at his disposal to drive a wedge between people who would seem to attack. The enemy will seek to drive a wedge between people who seem to be attached at the hip for the sole purpose of undoing the Lord's work. But notice here that David is not content to sit idly by and allow the horrible thing to happen. He does not get defensive. He doesn't stand up and retaliate against this ridiculous and sinful line of thinking. David is grieving just like all the rest of them, but rather than allow his thoughts and words to venture into the quicksand of anger and bitterness, he turns to the Lord. And he is again very alone in the land of the Philistines. But this time, he is alone while being surrounded by his supposed supporters. So he finds his strength in the Lord and the Lord's purpose and the Lord's peace. The truth of the matter is, if any of us are uplifted by the words and actions of the people around us, we will be undone just the same by their words and actions. Or as the saying goes, if you live by the compliments of people, you will die by their complaints. And instead of that, David found strength and perseverance in the Lord. And when he turned to the Lord, he discovered a plan of action. Verse 7. And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? He answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. This is a direct contrast to the last time we read about Saul. He had sought the Lord while continuing to live sinfully and had not heard anything in return. Now David was genuinely seeking the Lord with full faith and reliance on the Lord. David knew that there was no way for victory without the Lord. And even in his grief and despair, David seems to approach the Lord with the same attitude as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. David seems willing to accept if the Lord were to tell him no. And in Daniel chapter 3, verse 17 and 18, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had told King Nebuchadnezzar that even if the Lord does not physically rescue them, they will still stay faithful to him. David humbly asks the Lord both if he should chase after the raiders who took their families, and then if he will be successful if they do chase after them. And even in asking the questions, David seems willing to receive the Lord's no if that be his decision. Our faithfulness to the Lord should never depend upon whether or not he does and says what we want him to do and say. Faith is believing that God knows best and following him no matter what. So in the midst of great unrest among his men, David pauses to ask the Lord for a specific answer and a specific direction. And the Lord answers both questions in the affirmative. Verse 9. So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. David gathers up his disgruntled and nearly mutinous crew of men, and it would seem that they all immediately set out in hot pursuit of the marauders, a group of attackers that could come, raid a city, and carry off every inhabitant alive must have been quite a large group. A large group of soldiers cannot move unseen through any type of environment. These attackers most likely left behind some kind of visible sign of the direction into which they withdrew. So David and his men would know the general direction to begin their pursuit. They probably did not set out with an easygoing marching pace. I mean, this is most likely a very hasty pursuit as they were racing against the clock to find their families still alive. They came all the way to the brook Besor, which was the largest and deepest in that particular region of Judah. This was 16 miles from where their homes had been in Ziklag. So the men had just marched for days to come home and find it destroyed, and then they immediately set out in pursuit of an unknown enemy of unknown size for an unknown distance. Naturally, they would all be exhausted. And something that even today we sometimes forget, everyone experiences exhaustion differently. So 200 of the men stayed behind at the brook because they could not keep the pace that David wanted to maintain. Then David and the remaining 400 troops do not delay. Verse 11. They found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David, and they gave him bread and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So the men, they all take a moment in their pursuit to pause because they discovered a person out by himself. This was supposed to be a desolate region in the country where there were no settlements so much as, a sole wanderer should not be out there, but here they find one. But David and his men do find this random Egyptian who's not only a long way from anywhere, he's a long way from Egypt. So David then goes on to treat the man with great compassion by giving him nearly an entire feast here. He gets a fig cake, 2 whole clusters of raisins, he gets some bread, and he gets a good deal of water. And come to find out, this man had been out there without food or water for 3 whole days. He's probably near death just from thirst alone. He's probably extremely hungry. Then he ate and he drank, and his eyes were probably brightened. His strength returned. His mood shifted from desperation to gratitude. And I do wonder what David's men were thinking at this moment. They had been grumbling about killing David not too long ago because their families had been kidnapped. Then they had been making great time in pursuit of the captors, though they probably had since lost the trail, and now they all take a breather to give a feast to this wandering Egyptian. I wonder if the men were back to following and trusting David at this point, or were some of them still grumbling about this delay, even if this delay was going to get them back on track. This very unexpected delay from a very unexpected source was going to become much needed help in the rescue of their families. Verse 13. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" He said, "I am a young man of Egypt, a servant of an Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negeb of the Cherethites and against that which belongs to Judah, and against the Negeb of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, "Will you take me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band." So now we discover who this wanderer was, and it turns out what he reveals is a confession. He was an Egyptian slave to an Amalekite. So David discovers who it was that had attacked their homes, the Amalekites. This reminds me that if only Saul had obeyed the Lord, these Amalekites would not have been there to kidnap these families. Now David would have had a general idea of their location, the Amalekite region. This Egyptian had been left behind to die because he had become sick, and he could not keep up with the rest of the raiders as they returned home. And he confesses their entire battle plan of raids as they had performed against the Cherethites, the Calebites, the people of Judah, and against Ziklag. He admits to helping kidnap their families and to helping burn their homes. But notice, David doesn't instantly strike the man down for his confession. Rather, David asks the man for his help in finding the specific camp of his former master. The Egyptian is willing to help David find the specific Amalekites in exchange for immunity. Immunity from David and immunity from deportation back to his master. It's an interesting side note, these people called the Cherethites, because they are mentioned later. They had been attacked here by the Amalekites, but later in 2 Samuel chapter 8, as well as throughout 2 Samuel, we find out that they become loyal soldiers for David under the command of Benaiah. So maybe it was this very instance here of David attacking the Amalekites and freeing the people they had captured that brought about the loyalty of the Cherethites, which would be incredible. It's also interesting that this Egyptian slave asks for assurance from David with a promise sworn before God. Because Egyptians did not follow the Lord, nor did the Amalekites. Maybe this Egyptian knew David was an Israelite. Maybe he even knew who David was and believed that he could be trusted if he were to do something as though he were doing it for the Lord. So he asked David to promise the Lord that he, the Egyptian, will not be harmed, nor will he be returned in exchange for directions. We should show similar compassion to people who come across our paths, and we should do everything set before us as though we were doing it for the Lord. So thank you again for joining us as we walk verse by verse through the Old Testament. Next week, we will see what happens when David goes down to the Amalekites, as well as, hopefully, we'll be able to get into the chapter of the actual battle that is taking place between the Israelites and the Philistines.